In 2003, Threshold Entertainment released their first animated film in the form of Foodfight. While the film was largely panned by critics due to its oddly placed adult humor and wasted voice talent, it did receive some praise for its animation style, which combined the squash and stretch style of pre-blank code Disney cartoons with fully 3D animation that was still in its infancy at the time. More importantly, it was a huge box office success, which was largely attributed to the presence of many recognizable food product mascots. This made other film studios eager to capitalize on what they saw as Hollywood's next big trend. This culminated in two highly ambitious and constantly rivaling cinematic universes centered around the various mascots of two of the biggest breakfast cereal companies in the world, Kellogg's and General Mills. This is the War of Cereal Cinematic Universes. Many major Hollywood studios reached out directly to General Mills Incorporated in the hopes of acquiring film rights to their most recognizable mascots. General Mills, however, being a Minnesota-based company, thought it would be best to have their characters handled within the Midwest. Luckily for them, the same year Foodfight released, they acquired a recently bankrupt animation company based out of Lombard, Illinois. That company was Big Idea Entertainment. Big Idea was most well known at the time for its popular Christian-themed home video series VeggieTales, which revolutionized the 3D animation techniques used to create Foodfight. This home video series managed to avoid blank code restrictions due to the fact that episodes of VeggieTales did not technically qualify as movies. That is, until they attempted to release their first ever feature-length film, Jonah, a VeggieTales movie. Although planned for a 2002 release, the film was found in violation of the blank code, causing a $14 million loss for Big Idea, leading to their bankruptcy and being bought out by General Mills. General Mills, however, would not waste this acquisition and agreed to fund all future VeggieTales home video releases on the condition that the series creators, Phil Vischer and Mike Naraki, also produced blank code compliant feature films based on the various General Mills cereal mascots for theatrical release. Their proficiency in food-based entertainment was the perfect fit, and their Christian values would provide a family-friendly alternative for audiences who opposed Foodfight's adult humor. And thus, Phil Vischer and Mike Naraki began plotting out the General Mills cinematic universe. The first mascot that Vischer and Naraki decided to put on the big screen was arguably General Mills' most recognizable, Buzz the Honey Nut Cheerios Bee. They actually received a pitch from comedian Jerry Seinfeld, who said he had always dreamed of working on an animated film about bees. However, they felt that Seinfeld's dating history didn't align with their values, so they turned him down, and his dreams never worked out. Vischer and Naraki ultimately decided to write and direct the film themselves, and in 2005, they released Buzz's Bee Attitudes, a Honey Nut Cheerios movie. The film consisted of 8 smaller stories tied together with the framing device of Buzz, voiced by Phil Vischer's wife Lisa Vischer, who was known for voicing Junior Asparagus in VeggieTales, teaching kids about the Beatitudes and facing off against the self-righteous Queen Juliette Beezer, voiced by Megan Moore Burns, who previously voiced Madame Blueberry in VeggieTales. The film was ripped apart by critics and audiences alike, who called it a low-effort cash grab with none of the charm of VeggieTales. It also fell far below box office expectations, spelling a bad start for the General Mills cinematic universe. Phil Vischer and Mike Naraki realized they were in over their heads, but they knew they had to keep the films coming in order to keep their true passion, VeggieTales, alive and well. They dominated the home video, and now DVD, market because VeggieTales filled a specific niche while having enough charm to break out of that niche, without having to cave to the demands of the miserable movie makers. However, while explicitly Christian feature films were typically a safe bet when it came to abiding by the blank code, they fared much worse at the box office, especially overseas. In order to compete with the competition, particularly Kellogg, they needed filmmakers with more broad appeal. Enter Joel and Ethan Coen. Born and raised in Minnesota, the Coen brothers had already made numerous films together. However, none of them had been approved by the miserable movie makers, and therefore, the world had not yet seen what they were capable of. However, they had gained a reputation in Minnesota due to secret illegal screenings of their films held underneath General Mills headquarters. After accidentally attending one of these screenings, Vischer immediately struck a deal with the Coen brothers, offering them a 3-picture deal to adapt whichever General Mills mascots they wanted with full creative control, as long as the films contained some sort of moral. They immediately got to work on the first of 3 films for this deal. Given their affinity for subverting genre tropes, the Coens decided to make a heist film centered around Chip the Wolf, the mascot of Cookie Crisp, and Trix Rabbit, the mascot of Trix, teaming up to steal their respective cereals from a group of children. This played into how both characters had been depicted in their commercials, but by teaming them up, the Coen brothers could avoid retreading the same story in 2 separate films. Rather than using full 3D animation, which looked stiff and uncanny in Buzz's Beatitudes, they decided to combine 2D animation with live action, a technique first utilized in the TV movie It's the Girl in the Red Truck, Charlie Brown, and later revolutionized in Space Jam, a film that became immensely popular despite being objectively terrible. Vischer and Naraki initially pitched themselves to voice Chip the Wolf and Trix Rabbit. However, the Coen brothers, as well as the higher-ups at General Mills, felt that more star power was needed to boost box office potential. So, while the Coen brothers began their search for the perfect leads, Vischer and Naraki began a search of their own, to find a director to tackle the serial monsters. Being heavily inspired by Universal's pre-blank code depictions of classic monsters, which also inspired the first episode of VeggieTales, they knew that these characters had the most cinematic potential. They just needed the right director. That director turned out to be Raja Gosnell, who was well known at the time for directing the live-action Scooby-Doo films. While these films received largely negative reviews, they were very successful at the box office and seemed to be growing a bit of a cult following. Most importantly, Gosnell's ability to adapt Scooby-Doo's kid-friendly horror to the big screen was exactly what Vischer and Naraki needed for the serial monsters. The screenwriter of the duology, James Gunn, was not asked to join Gosnell on the project, however, due to Vischer and Naraki being put off by the adult humor present in his scripts. So, the two decided to collaborate with Stephen Sommers on the scripts, as Sommers had recently written and directed his own unique spin on the Universal monsters, Van Helsing, and had ties to the Midwest, having grown up in St. Cloud, Minnesota. And now, they had a plan. 2006 would not have any releases for the General Mills cinematic universe, but summer of 2007 would see the release of Chip and Trix, written and directed by the Coen brothers, and October 2007 would have Count Chocula, with Frankenberry releasing October 2008, and Boo Berry releasing in October 2009. All directed by Raja Gosnell and written by Stephen Sommers, Phil Vischer, and Mike Naraki. But sometimes, things don't go according to plan. While working on the scripts for Count Chocula and Frankenberry, the higher-ups at General Mills learned that the highly anticipated Chex Quest 3, a passion project for Charles Jacoby, would be ready for a fall 2008 release, and they wanted Vischer and Naraki to produce a film adaptation of the first two games, in time to coincide with the new game. To avoid overcrowding of their films in theaters or breaking up the yearly October release plan for the serial monster films, those three were delayed to 2009, 2010, and 2011 respectively. As for Chex Quest, they gave writing and directing duties to Pete Docter, an aspiring animator from Bloomington, Minnesota, who had yet to break into the industry. But they were impressed enough by his demo reel to give him a shot. Releasing wide on November 9th, 2007, Chip and Tricks Serial Robbers was led by Grizzly 2 and Return of the Killer Tomatoes star George Clooney as Chip the Wolf, and miserable movie maker favorite Nicolas Cage as Trix Rabbit. Steve Buscemi portrayed Chip's late owner and former partner in crime, Cookie Crook, in flashbacks, and Frances McDormand portrayed the film's antagonist, Officer Crumb, receiving criticism for her horrendous Irish accent. The film otherwise received a relatively positive response, with critics calling it an obviously dumb idea executed about as well as it could be. The post-credits sequel tease, revealing that McDormand's Officer Crumb was Lucky the Leprechaun in disguise, received a more mixed reception. But the Coen brothers took the criticism in stride and assured audiences that they would cast an Irish actor to play Lucky in the sequel. The execution of the film's moral about the importance of sharing also received some criticism from parents, who felt the film sent the wrong message by rewarding Chip and Trix for trying to steal the cereal from a group of kids. Despite these criticisms, the film was a financial success, and the sequel was announced for a 2012 release. On June 20th, 2008, Pete Docter made his directorial debut with Chex Quest, a direct film adaptation of the first two Chex Quest games that taught a lesson in non-violence. A then relatively unknown Chris Pratt voiced the lead role of Fred Chexter, alongside a supporting cast including Winona Ryder as Admiral Wheat, Christoph Waltz as Dr. Crispin-Bull, John Ratzenberger as Lieutenant Lucky Luke, Keanu Reeves as Joe Flakovich, Lacey Chabert as Belinda Bran, Matthew McConaughey as General Puffer, Jim Poole as General Breckfaust, and Tim Hodge as General Mills. You can see exactly where the budget ran out for the cast. This cast also led to less budget for the animation, which came across immediately in the final film, although the story and morals were praised. The film fell below box office expectations, barely breaking even. It was not until the following year, after the premiere of Parks and Recreation, that the film found major success on DVDs packaged with Chex cereal. 2008 also saw the release of The Pirates Who Don't Do Anything, a VeggieTales movie, which pulled Vischer and Naraki's attentions away from Count Chocula long enough for Raja Gosnell to bring on Jennifer's Body screenwriter Diablo Cody for some drastic rewrites. During these rewrites, Halle Berry was cast in the lead role as a gender-swapped Chocula, which caused heated debate over whether the casting was potentially insensitive. Samuel L. Jackson joined the film as Dr. Bran Helfing, a comedic take on Van Helsing, while other major roles were filled by the stars of the Scooby-Doo films, with Sarah Michelle Gellar as Mina Sweetwords, Freddie Prinze Jr. as Jonathan Hunger, Linda Cardellini as Lucy Taston, and Matthew Lillard as Cornfield. The film ended up as a sexy and comedic adaptation of the original Dracula story, acting as a lesson in resisting temptation. Despite Vischer and Naraki's horror at the resulting film, By the time it released in October 2009, Twilight had driven up demand for sexy vampires, and Halle Berry's Chocula bridged the gap to male audiences who weren't interested in Twilight, making this by far the most successful GMCU film at the box office. Diablo Cody declined the offer to rewrite Frankenberry, as she wanted to save her ideas for her own take on Frankenstein. As a result, 2010's Frankenberry was much darker and more dull than Chocula, but also felt more consequential in building the world and story for the GMCU. For example, the original Frankenstein story's titular Mad Doctor was substituted not with a cleverly named parody, but with pre-existing General Mills mascots, the Cinnamon Toast Crunch Chefs. The main chef, Wendell, played by Paul Giamatti, was set up as the GMCU's main antagonist, while Bob and Quello, played by Simon Pegg and Benjamin Bratt, respectively, acted as comedic relief before getting killed off by Frankenberry. As for Frankenberry himself, former wrestler and Minnesota Governor Jesse Ventura was cast for his towering stature, although he expressed discomfort with the heavy amount of prosthetic makeup required for the film, and only agreed to reprise the role in future films via voiceover. Critics felt Ventura was too old for the role, but felt the darker tone and moral of not playing God worked decently well. The film was a moderate success, but fell significantly below expectations set by Chocula the previous year. Although General Mills was happy with the success of Chocula and Frankenberry, Vischer and Naraki were unhappy with the more adult tone the movies were taking. To the shock of many, Raja Gosnell and Stephen Sommers were fired, and Boo Berry was delayed indefinitely until they could rework it into something more family-friendly. This, however, meant they were without a 2011 release, and contractually obligated to fill it. Chip and Tricks 2 wouldn't be complete until 2012, so Vischer and Naraki churned out The Cheerios Kid, which acted as a pseudo-sequel to Buzz's Beatitudes, with Lisa Vischer reprising her role as Buzz the Bee. The titular Cheerios Kid, played by Asa Butterfield, gained superpowers upon eating Cheerios and went on adventures with his friend Cheery O'Leary, played by Haley Steinfeld. This film was obviously deemed an even more shameless commercial than Buzz's Beatitudes, with the moral literally being, eat Cheerios. It failed to make a profit at the box office, but eventually became a cult classic. In 2012, the highly anticipated Chip and Tricks Lucky Charms released. This film centered around Chip the Wolf, Trix Rabbit, and the kids from the first movie, now teenagers, being recruited by Waldo the Wizard, played by Tim Blake Nelson, to steal the mysterious Lucky Charms from Lucky the Leprechaun, played by a then 17-year-old Saoirse Ronan. The movie also featured John Turturro as Cookie Jarvis, another wizard who helps the others defeat Waldo in the end when he's revealed to be evil. Some critics felt the film couldn't help but retread ground from its predecessor, despite its best efforts, although critics of the previous Chip and Tricks' moral praised the new one for actually condemning the characters who tried to steal the Lucky Charms, by forcibly sending them all back in time, a shocking cliffhanger ending that wouldn't be resolved for a decade. No matter whether people liked the movie or not, everyone seemed to agree that Saoirse Ronan's performance as Lucky the Leprechaun was phenomenal, and fan demand for her to get her own spin-off became rampant. In 2013, to coincide with VeggieTales' 20th anniversary, Phil Vischer and Mike Naraki sort of delivered on the premise of a Boo Berry movie with Bob and Larry Meet Boo Berry, a VeggieTales and General Mills crossover special, in which VeggieTales hosts Bob the Tomato and Larry the Cucumber, voiced as always by Vischer and Naraki themselves, meet Boo Berry, voiced by Jeff Goldblum, who's trying to help his friends Chocula and Frankenberry get over their fears. This led to the reuse of segments from the first VeggieTales episode, Where's God When I'm Scared, which critics said felt lazily tacked on to artificially reach feature length. The special's depiction of Chocula and Frankenberry also received mixed reception, because although Halle Berry and Jesse Ventura reprised their roles via voiceover, the more kid-friendly tone and story led to them feeling completely different from their previous film iterations, although somewhat closer to their original commercial iterations. Phil Vischer also took on the role of Fruit Brute, while Mike Naraki played Yummy Mummy, although both were just small cameo appearances. The monsters were also sent back in time at the end, because General Mills demanded some thematic tie-in. Although the GMCU had maintained yearly releases for the past 7 years, the failure of Bob and Larry Meet Boo Berry led to a multi-year-long hiatus. It was clear Vischer and Naraki struggled to accept the more mature tone that made the most successful entries work. They also had no idea how to resolve the big time travel cliffhanger that the Coen brothers had set up. So, they met with the Coen brothers to figure out how to wrap up the story in a satisfying manner. The Coen brothers proposed a 2-part grand crossover finale, with Part 1, showing the mascots trapped in biblical times, directed by Vischer and Naraki, and Part 2, bringing them back to modern times to face a new obstacle using the lessons they've learned, directed by the Coens. Vischer and Naraki liked the idea, but opted out of directing so as to not drag the finale down. They also agreed to give other filmmakers full creative control on any solo projects they wanted to tackle prior to the finale. The first filmmaker to throw his hat into the ring was Martin McDonagh, an Irish director and writer who promised to fulfill the fan demand for a Lucky the Leprechaun spin-off starring Saoirse Ronan. So, in 2017, he released Lucky, A Charmed Life, a 3-hour-long, dense drama in which present-day Lucky struggles to master her marshmallow-based magic, traveling back to her own childhood, reuniting with her old mentor, played by Colin Farrell, and even meeting Saint Patrick, played by Kenneth Branagh. Critics called the film slow and meticulous, but said die-hard fans of Saoirse Ronan's take on the character would be satisfied if they could make it through the lengthy runtime, which included a post-credits stinger in which Paul Giamatti's Chef Wendell returns and steals the Lucky Charms for some unknown plot. Another Hollywood icon with Minnesota roots was interested in joining the GMCU and had a pitch that was very personal to him. Noah Nelson, whose filmography we will cover in depth in its own episode, lost his cousin to a drug overdose back in 2015, which inspired him to write a screenplay about Sonny the Cuckoo Bird struggling with his addiction to Cocoa Puffs. This screenplay turned into the 2019 drama Puffs, directed by Todd Phillips, starring Noah himself as Sonny, Jack Nicholson as Gramps, and Amy Adams as Sonny's mother. This film was the best reviewed of the GMCU, and at one point held the title of the highest-grossing R-rated movie. First-time directing duo Joshua and Simon Wesley were hired to make a live-action remake of Chex Quest to coincide with the release of Chex Quest HD. Released in 2020, Chex Quest: The Complete Balanced Breakfast brought back Chris Pratt as Fred Chexter and incorporated the events of all 3 games, alongside the new playable characters from the HD remake, including Zoe Saldana as Wheatney Chexworth, Karen Gillan as Dr. Orion, Vin Diesel as Pretzel, Bradley Cooper as Knackle96, and Dave Bautista as Shane McBride. Although the cast was praised for their performances and chemistry, the Wesley brothers' direction was heavily criticized. This was seemingly the new canon version of Chex Quest in the GMCU, as it contained a post-credit scene of Paul Giamatti's Chef Wendell experimenting with phlegmoid DNA. For the first part of the GMCU's grand finale, Phil Vischer and Mike Naraki shopped around for a pre-existing biblical screenplay they could incorporate the General Mills mascots into, and accidentally bought the film rights to Andrew Lloyd Webber's hit Broadway musical, Jesus Christ Superstar. So, in 2023, they released What's the Buzz? Jesus Christ and the General Mills Superstars, an adaptation of the musical directed by Bill Condon, who previously directed 1991's Beauty and the Beast, as well as the Twilight Saga Breaking Dawn Parts 1 and 2. What's the Buzz? Replaced all characters of the musical except Jesus with one of the mascots. Buzz the Bee took on the role of Judas and was now voiced by Beyoncé because General Mills demanded more star power. Frankenberry took on the role of Caiaphas, and Jesse Ventura declined the opportunity to reprise his role, both due to the makeup and the singing, so John Cena was cast in the role. Other roles included Halle Berry's Chocula as Mary Magdalene, Jeff Goldblum's Boo Berry as Annas, Nicolas Cage's Trix Rabbit as Pontius Pilate, George Clooney's Chip the Wolf as King Herod, Asa Butterfield's Cheerios Kid as Peter, and Haley Steinfeld's Cheery O'Leary as Simon Zealots. As for Jesus, although Noah Nelson didn't appear as Sonny, he recommended his friend Xander Condie, whose performance was praised as the bright spot of an otherwise ill-advised film. The film, of course, did contain a post-credits scene, in which Lucky and the Chex Quest crew show up in a makeshift time machine to bring the other mascots back to present day. Before the grand finale of this cinematic universe, Todd Phillips and Noah Nelson reunited for a highly anticipated sequel to Puffs. Released in 2024, Puffs Grignoton Croquant Chocolate swapped the gritty realism of the original for fantastical musical numbers, as Sonny struggles to resist his addiction in a world completely overtaken by chocolate. Halle Bailey, who had seemingly not aged at all since starring in Disney's 1989 hit The Little Mermaid, was cast as a young Chocula who seduces Sonny, and Melissa Barrera plays an original character named Reese, who tries and fails to help Sonny overcome Chocula's temptation. The film was torn apart by critics and audiences and bombed at the box office, as it seemed to be one big fuck you to fans of the original. Noah Nelson, however, viewed it as one of his greatest cinematic achievements. And at last, in December 2026, the Coen brothers will release the General Mills Superstars in Attack of the Crazy Squares, in which all the mascots must team up to defeat Chef Wendell and his army of Crazy Squares, which he created by infusing his Cinnamon Toast Crunch with Lucky Charms magic and Flemoid DNA. Only time will tell if this finale will be worth the wait, but stories from behind the scenes have some fans concerned it will be a complete mess. Many feel that the General Mills cinematic universe had some interesting ideas, but became oversaturated over time. As Kellogg's showed with their cinematic universe, sometimes less is more.